6 months ago, they made my mother cry in front of 200 people. Tonight, I was going to make sure 2 million watched them lose everything. I was standing at the back of the ballroom, holding a glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking, and a folder I had every intention of opening. The Whitfield family was up on that stage, smiling under those gold lights, accepting an award called Legacy of the Decade. Eleanor Whitfield was crying real tears into the microphone. Charles had his hand on her back. Brooke and Trent stood behind them like polished little statues, perfectly dressed, perfectly fake. And my mother was sitting next to me in a dress I'd had custom made for her. She didn't know yet why we were there. She thought we were going to dinner. But before I tell you how that night ended, I need to tell you how it started, because this isn't really a revenge story. It's a story about a woman who spent 30 years being kind to people who didn't deserve it, and a daughter who finally said enough. My name is Hazel Brennan. I'm 28 years old. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, in a little blue house with a sewing machine that ran almost every night until midnight. That sewing machine belonged to my mother, Maggie. She raised me alone after my dad walked out when I was 4. I don't remember much about him, and honestly, I don't care to. My mother was enough. My mother was everything. Mom was a seamstress, not the kind that hems pants at a dry cleaner, although she did that too when money was tight. She was the real thing, the kind of woman who could look at a torn wedding gown and rebuild it from the inside out, the kind who could draft a pattern in her head while she stirred soup on the stove. Her hands were always moving, her hands were always tired. When I was 9 years old, a young woman named Eleanor Whitfield knocked on our door. She was pretty, ambitious, full of big talk about starting her own fashion house with her husband, Charles. They had no money, they had no team. What they had was a small storefront 2 towns over and a dream the size of Manhattan. Someone at the local fabric shop had told them about the woman who could sew anything. That was my mom. Eleanor offered Mom freelance work, alterations at first, then small custom pieces, then full gowns, then entire collections. For 12 years, my mother stitched the bones of Whitfield couture into existence in our living room, while I did my homework at the kitchen table and listened to the hum of the machine. I want you to understand something. The dress that put Whitfield couture on the map, the one a famous actress wore to the Oscars in 2003, the one that ended up in magazines around the world, my mother sewed every single stitch of that dress by hand. She worked on it for 6 weeks. She slept maybe 4 hours a night. Eleanor paid her $400. The dress sold for $40,000. Mom never complained, not once. She'd say things like, "Hazel, being kind costs nothing. You give people your best, and the universe figures out the rest." She believed that. She really did. She didn't know that some people take your best, sign their name on it, and then forget you ever existed. By the time I was in high school, Whitfield Couture had moved their operations to New York City. They didn't need a small-town seamstress anymore. They had a whole studio, a creative team, glossy advertisements in every magazine you could name. Mom wasn't bitter about it. She was proud. She'd point at a magazine spread in the grocery store checkout line and whisper, "I helped make that, you know?" I'd nod. I always nodded. But I noticed nobody else seemed to know. I went to college on a scholarship and a prayer. I studied business and ended up working as a junior buyer for a department store chain. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me close to fashion, and it paid my mother's mortgage when her hands started getting too stiff to take on as many private clients. She was 56 years old, and her fingers were starting to forget what they'd known their whole life. Then, last spring, the invitation came. Whitfield Couture was throwing a 30th anniversary gala in New York City, a glittering affair, black tie, 200 guests, press, celebrities, industry royalty. And tucked into the guest list, almost like an afterthought, was an invitation addressed to Margaret Brennan, listed under a category called Original Collaborators. Mom cried when she opened that envelope. I'm not exaggerating. She sat at the kitchen table, holding the cream-colored card in her hands like it was a holy relic, and tears just rolled down her cheeks. She said, "Hazel, they remembered me. After all this time, they remembered me." I should have known then. I should have felt it in my gut. But I wanted to believe it for her. So I helped her plan. I told her she looked beautiful when she showed me the dress she'd bought from a discount store in the next town over. It was navy blue with little silver beads on the collar. She got her hair done at the salon where she'd been going since I was a baby. She drove 6 hours to New York City by herself because I was on a buying trip in Chicago and couldn't get back in time. I told her, "Mom, take pictures of everything. I want to see all of it." She said, "I will, baby, I will." I didn't hear from her for 2 days after the gala. That should have been my first sign. Mom always called me, always. But when I finally got her on the phone, she sounded fine. Tired, but fine. She said the gala was lovely. She said the food was wonderful. She said Eleanor looked just beautiful. She didn't tell me what really happened until 2 weeks later, and only because I saw the post. It was a photo on the official Whitfield Couture social media page. My mother standing between Eleanor and Brooke, looking small and uncertain in her navy dress with the silver beads. The caption read, "Honoring our humble beginnings." There was a heart emoji. There were thousands of comments. I read those comments for an hour. People making fun of her hair, people making fun of her dress, people asking who let the cleaning lady into the photo, people saying she looked like someone's lost grandmother. The Whitfields didn't delete a single comment. They left it up. They were laughing, all of them, in that photo. And now I understood why. I drove to my mother's house that same night, 6 hours straight, no stops. I found her in the garden, weeding the same patch of dirt she'd weeded the day before. She looked up at me and tried to smile, and that's when she finally broke. She told me everything, how they sat her at a table near the kitchen, how Eleanor called her up during the speech, not to honor her, but to make a joke, how Eleanor said, and I'm quoting this exactly because I'll never forget the words my mother repeated to me, "And here's the sweet little seamstress from Pennsylvania who used to do all our mending back in the early days. Stand up, Maggie, let everyone see you." Brooke leaned into the microphone and said, "Oh my God, your dress is darling. Where's it from? Target?" And the room laughed. My mother stood up there for what felt like a year, smiling because she didn't know what else to do, while 200 of the most powerful people in fashion laughed at her. Then she sat back down, finished her dinner because she didn't want to seem rude, and drove home through the night. She told me, "Hazel, please don't do anything. People like us don't fight people like them. We just keep going." I held her hand. I told her okay. I told her I understood. I lied. That night, after she went to sleep, I climbed into the attic. There were boxes up there I hadn't seen in 20 years, Mom's old work boxes from her Whitfield years. I started opening them one by one, and what I found stopped my heart. Sketches, hundreds of original sketches in my mother's handwriting, dated and signed, of pieces that had appeared in Whitfield Couture's first 3 collections, pieces that had been credited to Eleanor in every magazine, every interview, every coffee table book. Letters between my mother and Eleanor on Whitfield Couture letterhead, discussing design choices, fabric sourcing, structural changes, receipts, contracts, proof that my mother wasn't just a seamstress, she was an uncredited co-designer. And then I found the note, a handwritten card from Eleanor dated 1996. The handwriting was looser then, younger. It said, "Maggie, I couldn't have done this without you. One day, the world will know your name. With all my love, Eleanor." I sat on the attic floor and I cried. Not for me, for my mother. For 30 years of silence she'd swallowed because she was too kind to demand what she'd earned. And then I stopped crying, and I started thinking. I had a network in this industry, not a big one, but a real one. I'd worked buying trips, fashion weeks, market events. I knew people. One of those people was a journalist named Daniel Pierce. He wrote for a major fashion publication, and we'd had drinks a few times after industry events. He was honest, which is rare in that world. I called him. I said, Hypothetically, if someone had proof that a major fashion house had stolen credit from an uncredited designer for 30 years, would that be a story? He said, depending on the proof, that's not a story, that's a bomb. I told him I'd be in touch. For the next 3 months, I lived a double life. By day, I went to work. By night, I scanned every document in those boxes. I cross-referenced dates with Whitfield Couture's published collection timelines. I built a paper trail you could drive a truck through. I matched my mother's sketches to runway photos, side by side. I authenticated the letters. I documented everything. And while I was digging, I found something else, something bigger than my mother's story. Buried in some old emails, I found correspondence between my mother and a Whitfield production manager from 2008. The manager was asking my mother for advice because she was uncomfortable with new factory partners they'd taken on overseas. My mother had told her to speak up. The manager had spoken up, and she'd been fired 2 months later. That manager's name was still findable. I tracked her down. She lived in North Carolina now, ran a small quilting business. She still had the emails. She still had documentation of labor violations Whitfield Couture had been hiding for nearly 20 years, while plastering ethically made across every advertisement. I called Daniel back. I said, "It's not just one story, it's a pattern." He said, "How fast can you get me everything?" I also found Roz. Roz was my mom's best friend from her early seamstress days. Roz introduced me to 2 other women who'd worked with the Whitfields in the early years. Both of them had similar stories: used, drained, discarded, never credited. One of them still had her own original sketches. By the time the 30th anniversary Legacy of the Decade gala was announced, I had a folder so thick I could barely close it. The gala would be televised, live-streamed, attended by industry royalty, celebrities, and 3 members of the Whitfield Couture corporate board. It was perfect. I used my department store credentials to get an invitation as an industry buyer. Daniel got me a press credential as a backup. I anonymously sent preview copies of key documents to 3 board members, including a man named Greg Mathers, who Daniel told me had been quietly disillusioned with the Whitfield family for years. I made sure the 2 other wronged designers had seats, and I bought my mother a real dress. It was midnight blue silk, custom made by a young designer in Brooklyn who'd actually heard of my mother's reputation. The dress fit her like it had been waiting for her. When she put it on, she looked at herself in the mirror for a long time and said, "Hazel, I haven't felt beautiful in a long time." I told her, "Mom, we're going to dinner in the city, just us, a nice night out." She believed me. She always believed me. The night of the gala, I drove her into Manhattan. When the car pulled up to the venue, she looked at the building, then at me, then at the building again. She said, "Hazel, what is this? Why are we here?" I took her hand. I said, "Trust me, Mom, just trust me." We walked in. The room was exactly what you'd imagine. Crystal chandeliers, a string quartet, women in gowns that cost more than most people's cars. I led my mother to a table near the front. People stared. Some recognized her. Most didn't. Eleanor took the stage at 8:30. She gave a speech about integrity, about craftsmanship, about family legacy. She talked about how Whitfield Couture had been built on respect for every person who touched the brand. My mother sat next to me with her hands folded in her lap. I could feel her shaking. Then came the Q&A portion. Daniel was in the press section. He raised his hand. The moderator called on him. He said, "Eleanor, in your early collections, particularly the 1998 and 2000 lines, several of the most iconic pieces have design elements that don't appear in any of your earlier sketchbooks. Can you speak to who actually contributed to those designs?" Eleanor laughed. She actually laughed. She said, "Oh, Daniel, those collections came out of my own hands, my own heart. There's no mystery there." That was my signal. I stood up. The lights were bright. My heart was hammering, but my voice was calm. I said, "Eleanor, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Hazel Brennan, and this is my mother, Margaret Brennan. The room went quiet. Eleanor's smile didn't quite move, but something in her eyes did. I said, 12 years of your early career were built on her hands, and I have a letter you wrote her in 1996 that I'd like to read out loud. I read the letter, the whole letter, the part where Eleanor said, I couldn't have done this without you. One day the world will know your name. I said, tonight the world will know her name. I held up the folder. I said, these are the original sketches, in my mother's handwriting, dated and signed, of pieces credited to Eleanor Whitfield in 3 published collections. These are the contracts. These are the letters. And this, I held up another folder, is documentation of labor violations the Whitfield brand has been hiding for 19 years while marketing themselves as ethically produced. Brooke shot up out of her seat. Her face was white. She started to interrupt, and I just calmly handed her a copy of the documents. She stared at them like they were on fire. Trent trying to wave over security. Greg Mathers stood up from the board's table and said, very loudly, sit down, Trent, we're going to hear this. In that exact moment, Daniel's article went live. I watched it happen. Phones started buzzing across the room like a swarm of insects. People were pulling up the article in real time, reading it, looking up, reading more. The 2 other designers I'd brought stood up. They held up their own evidence. They told their own stories. Eleanor tried to speak into the microphone. Her voice cracked. Charles tried to take it from her. He didn't have anything better to say. I looked down at my mother. She was crying, but this time it wasn't shame. This time she looked at me and she said, Hazel. Oh, Hazel. I said, I love you, Mom. We left through the front doors, together, in our beautiful dresses. We didn't run, we walked. The fallout came faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, Whitfield Couture's stock plummeted. 3 major retailers dropped the brand. The board voted Eleanor and Charles out by Tuesday morning. Brooke's sponsorships evaporated overnight. Trent issued a non-apology that just made everything worse. The Legacy of the Decade award was rescinded a week later. 3 established fashion houses approached my mother with consulting offers, big money, big titles. She turned every single one of them down. Instead, we opened a small shop on Main Street in our hometown. The sign on the window says, Brennan and Daughter. My mother does the design work, I run the business side. We make custom pieces for real people, wedding dresses for nervous brides, graduation outfits for proud mothers, suits for men who haven't been measured properly in 20 years. We're booked out 8 months in advance. The 2 other designers I worked with received settlements and proper credit in revised industry histories. Roz comes by the shop on Sundays and brings cinnamon rolls. Sometimes I sit in the back of the shop and watch my mother work. Her hands are still stiff some days, but she moves like someone who knows she's home. She hums while she sews. She didn't used to hum. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty about the Whitfields, about what they lost. I don't, not even a little. I didn't destroy them. They destroyed themselves the moment they decided my mother was small enough to laugh at, the moment they took her name off her own work and put theirs on it, the moment they sat her at the back table and turned her into a punchline. Legacy isn't what you put on a stage in front of 200 people. Legacy is what you stitch into the world quietly for 30 years, hoping nobody notices. My mother had a real legacy. They tried to steal it. They tried to mock it. And in the end, they handed it back to her in front of everyone they were trying to impress. They wanted to be remembered. Now they will be, just not the way they planned. My mother taught me that kindness costs nothing. And she's right, it doesn't. But cruelty has a price. And that night, in front of everyone who mattered, I made them pay it in full.